So to get started with this tutorial, you'll need to download the example files, which include this old school CRT TV, got the bulging old school screen, some buttons, some side speaker things, a little bit of a back thing, and an antenna here. So you can get that at blendersensei.com or by clicking on the link in the description of this video. And so if I hop over to my desktop, here's the actual example folder itself. So what we've got is the old TV.blend, and then this simple wood texture here, and then a screen fuzz texture here, and then the Blender Sensei logo covered with these old color bars here, because what we're going to make is sort of an old end of broadcast signal showing up on our TV screens, sort of the way it used to be back in the day when after a certain hour there was no programming on some channels. It was just a blank screen with these test color bars. Okay, so notice up here up top we are in the Blender render engine. And we're not going to spend too many more videos dealing with Blender render materials and rendering and stuff like that. But it's a good idea to have at least a cursory understanding of the Blender render engine, materials, and things like that if you're ever dealing with game assets. And in general, it can be a good learning tool for understanding the basics of what's going on with cycle shaders in the future. So we'll be diving into cycles soon, but for this tutorial, we will be using the Blender render engine. Okay, with the main body of this TV here selected, let's go ahead and on our material tab in the properties, give it a new material. And we can just call this TV, I suppose. And then under the texture tab, make sure that you are on the material icon here in the texture tab, which lets us know these are the textures that will go inside of this material that we have on this object here. And then we press new, and of course the default type is image or movie, which in this case it's what we want. So under image, let's press open, and then you want to navigate to where you downloaded your example folder, wherever that happens to be. So I've got this stuff on my desktop. Here's that folder here, and I'm going to select the board texture. Okay, we've got a texture in this material and this material on this object, but the object does not have a UV map, as we can see over here in the object properties. So we need to make one. So the standard process for producing a UV map for your object to put images on it is to head over into edit mode, and then we would press T to bring up our tool shelf, and then under our edge tools here, we could go through and manually shift scroll up and select edges and mark them. And this sort of lets Blender know where you want your cut lines to go for the skin of your object to be stretched out so you can then place images and things on top of it. However, I did a little testing before this video started, and it turns out that the Smart UV Project method ends up working pretty well for this TV base. So we're going to use that method to unwrap. So I'm going to press Clear Seams to undo those seams I just marked. I'm going to tap A to select everything, and under Unwrap here, I'm going to press Smart UV Project. And whenever you're using Smart UV Project, you always want to make sure this island margin is up to at least 0.6 because you need a little bit of room between your UV islands so that bleeding doesn't occur. And I'll show you what all that means here in a minute. So if I press OK, notice that now down here in the camera view, which is always in material viewport shading, we can see the texture now on our TV. So cool. So if we also, here in the big 3D view, press Alt-Z, or we can come down here and just manually switch this to material, we can now see the material on our TV. So before we do anything else, let's take a look at what kind of UV map that this Smart UV Project created for us. So to do that, we can either manually switch this to the image editor, or while we're working in this stuff anyway, we can quickly hop to that just by pressing this Edit UVs button here, which takes us here. So here's the UV map, and as we can see, there's pretty decent distribution here. The only thing that's not great is maybe how many little islands were produced. Now, if you're not familiar with UV maps, what you're looking at here is all the faces that compose this object, all the 3D polygons stretched out and laid flat. So for instance, you can see the screen here, this kind of bulging screen, which is now covered in wood, which is weird. We'll fix that in a minute. But you can see that that part is clearly laid out here. So if we, down here, we switch this to island selection, which lets us basically select groups of the UV map, which once again, a UV map is basically just the whole polygon mesh just stretched out and laid flat so that when we put an image behind it or paint on top of it, it will know where to go on the model. So if we select this island here where the TV screen is, notice that if I press S to scale this, notice that only the textures down in the camera area in the bottom right, only the areas over the screen are moving, and I'll right click to cancel that movement I was just doing, and not anything else. To some extent, there are really no super simple solutions when it comes to UV mapping. How advanced you're going to have to get with your UV map really comes down to the type of project you're working on. So for instance, if you planned on creating a UV map that would be easy for you to paint on in Photoshop or GIMP or something and still make sense, in other words, the faces would be connected in a way that would make sense when you look at them on the flat UV map, you would have probably needed to manually go through and mark these seams, so things that would be laid out flat in the way that makes sense to paint them. However, in this situation, because of the type of texture we're using, which blends really well into everything, we can get away with this kind of scattered approach. Also, when you are painting something from scratch, then you can also get away with this kind of scattered UV map approach, because so long as the UV map's laid out ahead of time, you can create new content on top of it however you want. If it didn't make sense, then just ignore it. But if it did, good. Another thing to understand about UV maps is that the UV map is not the image that the UV map is using. What we're looking at right now is this object's UV map. But I could select from any image that exists here in Blender from this button here in the image editor and use that image as the background of the object. So the UV map just gives instructions about how whatever image happens to be being used on the object to be placed. So the map itself is not the image that's being used in the texture. Okay, so what we're going to want to do is have an empty screen here that we can use. So to do that, we're going to need to get rid of the wood texture covering the screen. So we know our screen's here. So what we can do is where this says View, switch this over to Paint, press T to bring up our tools. I'm going to go ahead and close this menu because I don't really need it right now. And if you have the full version of ZeroBrush, then you'll see this Sensei tab and you have access to your ZeroBrush paint menu. However, if you just have ZeroBrush Lite, you still should see Blender's regular paint controls in this menu here. And what you're going to want to do is switch this mix value to Erase Alpha. And if you're using a tablet or something, you might want to disable the strength so that it's always at 100% strength here. And if you've got the full version of ZeroBrush, you can use this hardness slider to just bring this hardness of your brush all the way up to 1. But if you don't, you can access this paint curve option and choose one of these curve types. This would be the equivalent of dragging your hardness all the way up to 1. So what we want to do, and you can see the wood texture getting erased as I do this here. It's fine to go a little bit outside of these lines. This is what we were talking a minute ago about setting the margin of the Smart UV project to 0.6 and not just having it at 0. What that did was when it stripped all the flesh off this object to lay it out flat for us to paint on or do whatever we need to on it, is it gave a little room between each one of these islands of faces here. And that's why we have a little room to color outside of the lines when we want to remove all the color part of this texture from this image. You can also press X to decrease the size of your brush if you're finding it too hard to stay within the lines. Because it's fine to go outside of the lines, but you don't want this crossing over into one of these other faces, because then somewhere on the object will look messed up. So let's clean all that out. And you want to make sure you don't leave any specks or anything in there. So if I press go back, or I could just manually switch this to 3D view here, and we press tab to go back into object mode, we now have a perfectly clear screen. That's good, but what we're going to do is turn this front part of the screen into glass. Now we actually have another object just behind this glass that we're going to use for our transparent images, because we're going to set their emission, their glow value on, and it will be like it's glowing through the glass, which will be super cool. So if I were to come down here in my outliner and expand this old TV, you can see all the different objects that are parented to this main big TV base. That's why they all move whenever we move it, because they're parented to it. So if I press on this screen here, then press G to grab, here's the actual screen we're going to use to be putting images and stuff on. And we're going to make the glass part of the screen of the TV box itself into glass by adjusting some material values. I'll press Ctrl Z to undo the movement of that because I need it where it is, and I'll close that up in my outliner. We erased the texture part of the image that's on the texture that's on the material that we have on this object here, but we still can't see through it. To do that, we're going to first need, for the TV material itself, turn on the usage of transparency. Then under here where it says alpha, we need to bring that all the way down to 0. Now right now the TVs has become totally invisible because that's exactly what we told the material to do. So over here in the texture, I'll go ahead and close up this image menu here under influence. If we turn on alpha there, now we have given the alpha influence of this texture with this image on it where we erase that part of the texture there. And so now if we click off of this, we can actually see straight through here. And we can see just to the screen that is actually behind here. On the material itself, instead of using Z transparency, which will, if we were to press render preview down here in our camera area, what this will do is just make the screen completely invisible, but we don't want that. What we would like is if the invisible area would behave more like glass. So to do that, we can use this ray trace setting. And so now if we press render preview, this will be behaving more like glass. Right now it's still looking pretty invisible, but some things we can do to change that are to decrease this IOR value, index of refraction, to something just slightly under 1, such as 0.98 here. And you can see as soon as we do that here down in the camera area where we have render preview still on, we can see a bit of the glare from the glass now if we rotate this to its side. They're coming out there. Also, we can increase this filter value, which gives it a little more presence. Increase this just a bit, this blend just a tiny bit, decrease the gloss just a little bit, and increase these samples. And so now we've got some actual glass here that's going to become much more apparent as glass in a minute. Also, if under lights we turn on ambient occlusion, we will begin to see this TV screen start behaving much more like a black glass TV screen. So cool. All right, so we'll go ahead and turn that off. Now on to the screen itself. Let's go ahead and click on that. And if you're not sure you actually have that selected, just notice right down here in white where it actually tells you which frame you happen to be on. It will also tell you which object you have selected. Okay, so let's go ahead and give the screen a new material. And let's rename this material to screen. I'll close that up for now. And then under the screen's material textures, make sure we're on the material icon. So we're dealing with textures belonging to the material and not to the world or something. We'll press new, which default type is image or movie. I'll close up influence for now. And then under image, we want to select an image. So let's press open and get to where our examples folder is. And the first one I'm going to load is this Sensei in broadcast.png here. Okay, so we got that image loaded into this texture, which is good. But we are not yet seeing it on the screen because once again, the object that is the screen also needs a UV map. And if we click on the UV maps, we can see there are currently none here for this screen object that we have selected. If I press Z to go into wireframe, you can see the outline of that selected screen there. Press tab to go into edit mode. To make this easier, I'm going to quickly double tap tab, which will hide everything but what you happen to have selected at the moment, which was this screen object. So under unwrap, just select smart UV project and make sure this is up at the island margin is at least at 0.06, press OK. And we can see part of our image on there. So let's go ahead and press edit UVs to get to our UV map here. And if we switch this from paint back to view, that will let us actually edit the UV map. And now that we're on the UV map, we can go ahead and select the image we're using to go ahead and adjust it the way the UV map needs to be adjusted. So let's select that Sensei in broadcast there. Okay, so if you look at this UV map, what's going on here is that there's all these bunched up faces here, which represent all the faces of the front, but then there's this one really big one. And what the one really big one is, if we turn this around, is actually this face here on the back. And since we won't be using this back image, we can go ahead and scale this down and just sort of put it out of the way somewhere like down here, and then turn this around to the front and select island selection so we can select the whole island of faces there. And let's just press S to scale, middle mouse to constrain to get this to be a little more space between this so it's not so squished. Next, we're going to actually rotate this whole island. So let's press R to rotate, hold Control to constrain. And let's just rotate this until it looks how it's supposed to on our screen down here. Whoops, that's what I meant. All right. So now I'm going to scale this back out even further so that this is not squishing our image on the screen. And I'm going to scale the whole thing up a little bit to get the Blender logo just a little smaller on the screen itself. Okay, great. So let's press go back now. And now we have this properly on the screen. We can double tap tab to get everything back out of quick hide mode. And if we press tab to go into objects mode, we now have this glass covering this screen here, which is cool. Okay, so let's go ahead and rename this texture here. We'll just call it something more meaningful, such as Sensei logo. And let's click on this next texture slot down here and add another texture. So let's press new, and under image, we want to press open and get to our examples folder and load up this screenfuzz.png. So if you watch the previous videos, you'll remember that I said if you're familiar with Photoshop, you're used to the flow of layers going down this way. So say I were to decrease the transparency of this layer or something like that, you would then expect that to affect things going down this way, but in Blender, it's the other way around. Basically, you're sort of thinking of the flow of textures going from underneath up rather than from up to down in Photoshop. So just so you're aware of that. Let's go ahead and rename this to, we'll call this Fuzz. So first thing we want to do is put this fuzz texture up behind this Sensei logo, so it will be behind it. Once again, if we were in Photoshop, you would think about the position of this Sensei logo would be already on top of this fuzz, but Blender looks at it the opposite way. So we want to select the fuzz and push it up. So now we have this Sensei logo, which is this color barred out like a 70s TV screen, sitting on top of this fuzz texture. But let's go ahead and click on the fuzz, and I could switch this to lighten, divide, but we'll just leave this on linear light here and adjust this color value just a little bit, which gives us a nice mix here. Now I want to make this screen glow, so I could do that for individual elements of this. I could select the Sensei logo texture, turn on emit, and make just specifically this transparent PNG image glow. So I could even, increase that by pressing 2 or something there. But what I want is for the whole screen to glow. So I'm actually going to disable that, and over in the material slot under shading, I'm going to turn on emission for the whole material of this screen. So we've got this whole thing kind of glowing. And you can see easily right there, because we can animate these properties, how this could be something we could sort of have glowing in and out if we wanted to have a TV screen kind of flickering and glowing, which would be pretty sweet. Well, let's bring this up to about 0.5 or so. And so right now, if under my lights I were to turn scene brightness all the way down, we can basically just see the screen. If I press render preview now, we won't really see the glow coming off the screen affect anything else. But if we turn render preview off and head over to the world tab and turn on indirect lighting, and under gather, change this to approximate. Once again, these settings are only for Blender render. If you're in cycles and you're using an emission node, its light will bounce onto everything's automatically, which is great. So a little more cumbersome in Blender render. But if we press render preview here, we can now see the glow of this screen affecting the environment and shining onto the sides of the TV, which is pretty cool. Okay, I'll go ahead and turn that off and increase my lights back up. So we're about done here, but let's go ahead and fancy things up a little bit more. First of all, I would like the color of this TV to be a lot darker, maybe something like some sort of cherry wood, so I could click on that. And under the texture, make sure I'm on the material icon for the texture options here. And I'll close up influence, and this can be controlled under colors. Now we can adjust brightness, contrast, and the color itself. However, when you adjust these, you'll only be able to see the effects when you're doing a render preview or when you're actually rendering. So I'll go ahead and turn my render preview button on. And I think I'll go ahead and disable ambient occlusion for now, because it slows down the render preview quite a bit. Okay, so I could start to make this darker by bringing down this brightness. And something else slowing me down a lot is the ray traced transparency we're using on this material. So I'll go ahead and shut that off just for a second to make my little render tests go faster, so I can see how my wood texture is actually looking. So I'll turn render preview back on, and notice that this updates a lot faster now that we've turned off the transparency. So just while we're setting this up, so lower the brightness, increase the contrast a bit more. This wood's definitely starting to get to a place where I like it more. And let's increase the red value because I want it to be kind of like a dark cherry looking kind of wood rather than whatever it is now. And maybe split the difference of that last drop in brightness, so 0.65. Maybe bring up the contrast one more. Okay, great, that looks a lot better. Okay, I'll turn my render preview button off, and then I'll close up colors and image mapping and back under influence. Let's turn on normal mapping to give this a bit of bump mapping, although that's way too much there. We just want a super, super subtle, tiny amount, so maybe -0.1 here. And that just gives us a little extra appearance of something tangible about the graininess of this wood. And we could also turn on texture control for a specular hardness and color, and maybe increase this. And back in the material properties, we could turn transparency back on now that we're done adjusting the way the wood looks when it renders. What I want to do is quickly create some materials for this back here and this antenna and stuff like that. So let's first select the buttons here. I'm just going to, under material, make a new material. And I'm just going to call this black shiny because that's about the gist of what I want it to be there. So I'm going to change this diffuse down to black. I'm going to turn on this mirror value and increase its reflectivity all the way up. I'm going to turn on the blend, which will blend this material a bit. Maybe we could even turn this material preview on and get a look at it as we're doing this. And we want to drop the gloss a little bit, increase these samples up to about 30 or so, and this gives us even better looking thing. Maybe increase this just a little bit more. Okay, so let's zoom in on here and see what these are looking like when we press our render preview button. Okay, that's pretty sweet. So I'll go ahead and turn that off. Let's go ahead and give that material to this top part of this antenna and shift select this object back here. And if I press Z, we can see, okay, those are the objects I have selected. And what I can do is I could manually do this for each one, select black shiny from this button here on the material tab, which gives us access to all the materials that exist in the file. Or we could just press Q and under material options, assign material, press this one, and this will assign everything selected all at once. So that's pretty useful. Now what I'm going to need is something metallic for these antennae. And since I basically set up the reflective values for this black shiny material, that's just about what I need. So what I'm going to do is select that black shiny for this. But now I just want to adjust this material to where this is white basically. But if I were to adjust this right now, this will change it for all of that same material, and I don't want that to happen. So what I'm going to do is press this plus button up here where this material is. And what that will do is turn this material on the antenna into its own new material. So now if I adjust its color or make any other change to it, it'll just do it for this object with this new material. So I'll go ahead and rename it from black shiny 0.001, which is what happens when you make a copy of something, to antenna, I suppose. Maybe under the mirror value, bring down this and this blend value, and maybe make the gloss all the way up here. And let's see how that looks. Well, we just about can't see it with this super white environment. So let's, under the lights, let's bring this scene brightness all the way down to 0. Let's press Shift A, and under lamp, add a spotlight, G to grab. We'll bring this over here, something like this. And maybe turn on my widget here and just select rotation so I can, kind of easily rotate this thing around. And I would like to increase the size of this circle here and increase the blend of this also. Press G to grab, something like that. And so now I've just got my sweet little TV here. And if we press render preview, I think I'll bring the energy of this spot lamp down. And I think I'll turn the emission value of the screen up much more. Okay, got the screen selected there. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off because I don't need that. And under shading, under emit, we'll bring that up a lot higher. And press render preview. Okay, cool. Now we have much more the effect of like an actual glowing screen. Let's also go ahead and turn ambient occlusion back on. And let's give this floor some kind of matte finish. So I'm just going to press new, and I'm going to name this material ground. And we're going to turn on the mirror value, turn the reflectivity up, blend it some, and lower this gloss value, which allows us to get some really nice smoothing in there. And maybe experiment with the position of these lights. So let's do a quick render and see how this is actually looking. So this looks pretty sweet, but there's a few not good things going on right now. This screen image seems to be coming through the actual TV, even though the TV is set to full opacity. So I'm not sure why that is, but it's not great, but we can fix that if we press go back, select this actual screen, we press Z to go into wireframe, and press 1 to go into front view, and press S to scale this down a bit. Now if we press our render preview button, well, it's still coming through more than we want, which is not great, so let's scale it down some more. Let's go back here and press G to grab. Let's just get that absolutely as close as it can go. Press render preview. That seems to mostly fix this issue, but there's still a little bit of this screen coming through where this wood should be, which should be occluding it, which is a little weird. So I'm not sure why that's happening. I'm pretty sure it's not supposed to be happening, but we can still work around it if we press render preview, turn that off. So what I'm going to do is just scale this back screen down just a hair, and let's see if that fixes it. Okay, great. Looks like that got rid of that issue of the screen coming through there for us. So let's back this up again like this. Maybe increase the energy of this lamp just a little bit more, and press 5 to go into top view. Maybe rotate it to where it's looking at the TV from the back here, and let's try a render of that. And we're having these buffer shadow issues, and that's because I forgot when we added this spotlight here, the default shadow method is buffer, so we would need to turn that on to raise shadow, and we could render again. But before I do that, I'm going to go back, and I think I'm going to press D to duplicate this light and decrease its energy. So I've got a secondary light source, rotate that around just to give a little more dynamicism to this scene and this TV here. Okay, so make sure that the shadow is set to ray, increase these samples up to about 10 or so, and let's go ahead and turn ambient occlusion back on, and let's give this a test render. Okay, pretty sweet. Looks like an old TV to me. Alright, so thanks for watching. I know this one has been a bit of a battle, but it's really good that you're experimenting and learning about the Blender render engine before we get into cycles. It will give you a lot of great insights. One more quick thing before we go, I want to mention a tip about handling UV maps. So if I press go back here and down here under lights, go ahead and turn my scene brightness back up so we can see things a little better. This texture here works pretty well for this faux wooden TV surface because it's very homogeneous and very similar. But if you're dealing with something else and you've got areas where seams meet up like this, so you can see this kind of hard seam here, you can use the clone brush to manually paint on these, and we're going to get more into zero brush and zero brush light in the future. But real quickly, if we go ahead and press this button here, we can press space and select the clone brush here, and then you can right click to set the cursor where you want the beginning of the clone to work. You can control the hardness, make it real low, and then paint over an area like this to get rid of these seams in your UV map. So just a little bit of a quick tip and a little bit of a taste of things to come. So thanks for watching. Hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'll catch you next time.